There was a man in Vietnam whose entire job was to take off his shirt, take off his equipment, take a flashlight and a pistol, and lower himself headfirst into a hole in the ground that was too narrow to turn around in. He volunteered for that. And there was another man, in the same country, in the same year, in the same uniform, whose entire job was to sit in an air-conditioned office in Saigon, type requisitions, eat 3 hot meals a day in a proper mess hall, and go back to a bunk with clean sheets on it every single night. Same war, same army, same 12 months. Tonight, we are going to rank every job in that war, from the worst one to the best one, and take our time doing it. I am going to give you about 30 of them, one at a time, and for each one I will tell you what the man actually did, what it cost him, and why it sat where it sat on the list. Some of the placements will surprise you. A few of the jobs that sound glamorous are much further down than you would expect, and 1 or 2 that sound miserable turn out to have been quietly excellent. One small thing before we begin, and then I will not interrupt you again. Tap the like button and subscribe while you are still awake enough to do it. And leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from tonight. I read every one of them. It helps this channel more than you would think. Thank you. Now put the phone down and let your shoulders come away from your ears. Before we start, one thing about the ranking itself, because it matters. I am not ranking these by how likely a man was to be killed. That is a different list. It is a much heavier one, and the honest figures behind it are more complicated than anything that belongs in a program designed to help you fall asleep. What I am ranking is the daily life. How much weight he carried, how wet he was, whether he slept, whether he ate hot food, whether anyone woke him at 2 in the morning, whether he could take his boots off, how much of his year was spent uncomfortable, and how much of it was spent merely bored. By that measure, the gap between the top of this list and the bottom of it is one of the widest gaps that has ever existed inside a single army. There is nothing here you need to remember in the morning. If you fall asleep somewhere around number 22, the rest will still be here tomorrow night, and so will I. We are starting at the bottom. One note on the numbering before we go, so you are not confused later. I am going to add a few entries with halves in them as we descend, because there are jobs that belong between 2 others, and I would rather squeeze them in than leave them out. It is an inelegant solution, and it is the honest one. Number 30, the tunnel rat. We may as well begin where we opened, because nothing else on this list comes close. The tunnel systems in certain areas of that country were extensive, dug by hand over many years, with multiple levels, ventilation shafts, living spaces, storage, and connecting passages built deliberately narrow. When an American unit found an entrance, somebody had to go down. The men who did it were volunteers, and they were selected partly for size, because a large man physically could not do it. They went in with a flashlight, a pistol, and often almost nothing else, because equipment catches on the walls of a passage built for someone smaller than you. Down there, the air was poor, the heat was worse than the surface, and there was no room to turn around. You went forward, or you backed out the way you came, feet first, blind. Everything about that job is at the extreme of every category on my list. The confinement, the air, the dark, the complete absence of anybody who could help you, and the specific knowledge that whoever built the passage knew it, and you did not. There is no ranking system anybody could design in which this is not number 30. The men who did it were, by every account from the units they served in, a particular kind of person, not reckless, methodical, the kind of calm that is more unsettling than bravado. Number 29. The point man. An infantry unit moving through vegetation travels in a file because that is what the terrain allows, and the man at the front of that file is the point man. His job is to find the way, to read the ground, and to be the first person to encounter whatever is there. Everything is harder at the front. He is cutting or pushing through growth that the men behind him will walk through in a path he has already opened. He is reading the ground continuously for signs, which is exhausting in a way that is entirely mental and which cannot be sustained indefinitely. Good units rotated the point man frequently for exactly that reason. He also has nobody in front of him, which sounds obvious and is the entire job. The position went to experienced men, and in most units it was not a punishment, but a mark of trust, which tells you something about how the infantry valued competence over rank. A frightened new arrival at the front of a file is a danger to everybody. A man who has been there 8 months and knows what a disturbed leaf means is worth having up there. Number 28. The combat engineer clearing a road. Every morning, before anything could move on a road, somebody had to establish that the road was safe to move on. That work was done on foot, slowly, at the front of everything, with detectors and with eyes, at the pace that thoroughness requires, and not at the pace that anybody wanted. Think about the psychology of that as a daily routine rather than as an event. It is not a moment of danger. It is a shift. It begins in the morning. It lasts for hours. It covers the same stretch of road it covered yesterday, and it has to be done with complete attention from the first meter to the last, because attention that fades at the end is worse than useless. Then the convoy moves, and everybody who drives on that road spends the day slightly safer because of work they did not see. And the next morning it all has to be done again, because a road is only clear for as long as nobody has been on it since. Number 27. The radio operator. The RTO carried the radio, and the radio of that era was not light. Add the batteries, add the spare batteries, because a radio without power is a heavy box. Add the fact that he carried everything a rifleman carried in addition to all of it. He also had an antenna sticking up above his head, which made him the single most identifiable person in the unit from a distance, and which every soldier in every army understands the implications of without needing it explained. And he could not put it down. A rifleman at a halt takes his pack off. The RTO stays near the radio because the radio is the unit's only connection to artillery, to aircraft, to medical evacuation, and to anybody who might come and help. The job usually went to somebody young and reasonably bright, and it made him permanently useful and permanently burdened, and it kept him within a few feet of the officer for a year, which is its own kind of experience. Number 26. The machine gunner. The squad's machine gun of that war weighed in the region of 23 pounds before a single round of ammunition was attached to it. Then the ammunition. Belted, heavy, carried by him and distributed among the men around him, which created a whole small social structure inside a squad about who was carrying whose belts and how the load got rebalanced when somebody was tired. He carried that up hills, through paddies, across streams where a man goes in up to his chest and has to hold something that heavy above the water. And when a unit stopped, his gun went where the fire needed to be able to go, which meant he did not get to choose a comfortable spot. The machine gunner in any infantry unit occupies a strange position. He is carrying the most weight and doing the most physical work, and he is also the most valuable single man in a firefight, and everybody knows both of those things, so he is simultaneously the most complained about and the most protected person in the squad. Number 25. The mortar crew. A mortar is an elegant weapon in principle and a brutal one to carry. The tube, the base plate, which is a slab of metal whose only job is to be heavy enough not to move. The bipod, and then the rounds, which are the real problem, because a mortar is only useful with a supply of ammunition, and each round weighs what it weighs. That gets distributed. Everybody carries a round or two. The crew carries the rest. At the halt, the crew digs the position in, sets up, registers the tube, and is ready to fire before most of the unit has finished settling. Then they sleep beside it, and they are the ones woken first if anything happens, because their weapon is the unit's immediate answer at night. They also spend a great deal of their time doing nothing at all, which is true of most jobs in most wars, and which sits alongside the physical labor rather than replacing it. Number 24. The long-range patrol team. Small teams, deep out, for days at a time, with the specific mission of observing rather than fighting. Everything about that job is deliberate deprivation. They carried the lightest possible load, which meant the freeze-dried rations we have discussed on other nights, and the minimum of water, and very little else. They did not cook, because cooking makes smell and light. They did not talk. They moved slowly and lay still for long periods, and they were, by design, a very long way from any help. The men who did this work talk about the silence more than anything else, days of it, whispering when speech was unavoidable, communicating by touch and by hand signal, sleeping in short pieces while somebody else watched, which is the ordinary infantry arrangement made much sharper by the size of the group. It is a demanding job in a way that has almost nothing to do with strength and almost everything to do with discipline and nerve. Number 23.5. The man carrying the extra. Every infantry unit has a category of load that does not belong to anybody in particular, and therefore belongs to everybody. The spare radio batteries, the extra machine gun ammunition, the mortar rounds, the demolition charges, the claymores, the water for the group, the sandbags, on a day when sandbags are needed. That load gets distributed at the start of a movement, and the distribution is one of the most quietly revealing rituals in the whole infantry. The new man gets more. That is universal, and it is not entirely cruelty. It is partly that he has not yet learned what to leave behind, and partly that the men who have been there 10 months have earned something, and this is the currency it comes in. The strong men get more, because they can. And somebody is always carrying something that is not theirs, because the man whose it was is having a bad day, and nobody says anything about it, and it gets remembered. If you want to know how a squad was actually functioning, you did not need to watch it in contact. You needed to watch the 10 minutes when the extra load got handed out in the morning. Number 23. The rifleman, the baseline, the default. The job most men in that war did. Everything we have spent other nights describing lands here. He carried 60 pounds or more. He was wet for months. His feet came apart. He slept in pieces on the ground. He ate out of cans. He walked most days for most of the day, and dug in most nights, and did it again the next day. He is not lower on this list than the specialists above him for one reason only, which is that he was carrying slightly less than the machine gunner and the radio operator, and was not the one at the front of the file. That is the entire difference. In every other respect, his year was identical to theirs. If you want a single mental image for the middle of this list, It is a 19-year-old sitting on his helmet at 4 in the afternoon with his boots off, drying his feet with a rag, having walked since dawn, about to open a can. Number 22. The medic and the corpsman. He carried everything the rifleman carried, plus a bag full of medical supplies, and he walked the same distance under the extra weight. That alone would put him here. But the reason he is not lower is that his job came with something the others did not have, which is standing. The medic occupied a position inside a unit that has almost no equivalent in civilian life. He was not senior. He frequently was not respected in the formal sense, and on the one question that belonged to him, whether a man was going to the rear, his word was absolute and nobody argued. The weight of that job was not physical, though the physical part was real. It was that every man around him depended on him personally, and he knew all of them by name, and he was 20. Number 21.5. The scout dog itself. I'm not going to pretend an animal held a military occupational specialty, but the dogs were assigned, trained, transported, fed, treated, and worked exactly like personnel, and this list would be dishonest without them. The job was the hardest physical assignment on the whole list, measured against the body doing it. Working in that heat, in a coat that does not come off, at the front of a column, using a sense that requires constant active attention for hours. The heat was the main threat to them ahead of anything else. Handlers rested them deliberately, watered them before themselves, and watched them for the early signs the way a medic watches a man. And the dogs did it willingly, day after day, for a reason that had nothing to do with the war and everything to do with the person holding the lead. Number 21. The dog handler. He walked at the front with the dog, which is where the dog is useful. He carried his own load, plus water for an animal that needed more of it than he did. He rested the dog before he rested himself, checked its paws before he checked his own feet, and shared his rations with it against instructions. And he was working all day at a level of attention that is genuinely tiring, because his job was to read the animal continuously. A dog's alert is not a bark. It is a change in the set of the ears, a shift in posture, a stiffening. He had to see it and interpret it and decide. The handlers described the year as physically hard and emotionally strange, because they spent it with an animal they lived beside and were entirely responsible for, in a place that was hard on the animal. Number 20. The riverine crew. Men who worked the rivers and the canals lived on their boats. That put them permanently near water, which meant permanently damp, in a small, crowded space where nothing dried. Their skin conditions were, by the accounts, at least as bad as the infantry's, and often worse. Their boats sat in the sun, and a metal hull in that latitude becomes an oven with nowhere else to go. The noise from engines at close range in a confined space was its own problem, and the hearing consequences show up in that population as clearly as anywhere. But they slept on the boat, most nights in the same place, with their equipment nearby. They could cook. They did not carry 60 pounds anywhere on their backs. That combination of permanent damp and no marching puts them exactly here in the middle, which is where most of the men who did it would probably place themselves. Number 19. The armored crew, the men in tanks and personnel carriers, had two enormous advantages and one enormous disadvantage. The advantages were that they did not carry anything and that they had storage. A vehicle carries the water, the rations, the ammunition, and the personal gear, and the crew rides. After a year of listening to infantrymen describe their loads, the difference is not marginal. They also had an engine, which meant warm food heated on a manifold and no fire to light. The disadvantage was the inside of the vehicle in that climate, which is difficult to convey to anybody who has not sat in one. A metal box in tropical sun, with an engine in it, is a temperature that people do not believe until they have felt it. Crews described losing extraordinary amounts of fluid on an ordinary day of doing nothing at all. They also had dust, in quantities that got into everything, and the specific fatigue that comes from vibration and engine noise for hours. Number 18 and a half, if I am allowed one. And I am, because it is my list. The ammunition handler. Artillery consumes ammunition at a rate that people outside the subject consistently underestimate, and every single round of it was moved by hand at some point in its journey. Off the aircraft or the truck, into the stack, out of the stack, to the gun, prepared, loaded. A round for a medium gun is not something one person casually lifts, and there were days when a battery went through a great many of them, one after another, for hours in the heat, by men who had been asleep 20 minutes earlier. It is the least discussed physical labor of that entire war, and it is one of the heaviest. Number 18. The artilleryman on a fire support base. He lived in one place, which is the single biggest thing on this list. A fixed position means a bunker with a roof, a place to keep your things, hot food when it could be flown in, and the possibility of a shower. It means not walking. It means knowing where you will be sleeping tonight. What it costs is the noise and the schedule. An artillery battery fires when it is asked to fire, and it is asked at every hour. A fire mission at 2 a.m. means the whole crew is up and working in the dark, in a hurry, in bare feet sometimes, and the gun is very loud at close range without any hearing protection at all. The physical work is heavy in bursts rather than constant. Rounds are not light, and there are a great many of them. And in between there is an enormous amount of nothing, filling sandbags and improving the position and waiting, which is the condition of most soldiers in most wars. Number 17. The door gunner. He flew, which meant he was exposed in a way that is obvious, and he was in the air over terrain rather than walking through it. But at the end of the day, in most cases, the aircraft returned to a base area. He slept in a bed, or something like one. He ate at a mess hall. He was not sleeping in mud, and he was not carrying his home on his back. His costs were the noise, which was severe and constant, the vibration, the heat in an aircraft sitting on a pad in the sun, and a schedule that ran on demand rather than on any clock. The men who did it describe it in terms of intensity rather than endurance. Extremely demanding hours and then a shower. That combination is why he sits here rather than lower. On the criteria I set out at the beginning. Sleeping in a bed matters enormously. Number 16 and a half. The air traffic controller at a forward strip. I placed the controller among the honorable mentions, but the ones working the smaller forward fields deserve their own line, because their situation was different from the man in a proper tower at a large base. A forward airstrip is a length of steel planking laid on graded earth, with a small structure beside it, and the traffic through it in a busy period was relentless. Helicopters constantly, transports on a schedule that was not really a schedule, and everything arriving with a different priority. The man managing that was doing a job of genuine complexity, in the heat, under pressure, with a radio and his own eyes, and frequently very little else. He lived on the strip, which meant he had a place and a routine, which is why he is here and not lower. Number 16. The combat photographer and the correspondent. He went where the infantry went. carried cameras and film in addition to his own gear, and did all of it while trying to work rather than just survive. The specific difficulty of that job is that it required him to be doing something else at the exact moment everybody around him was doing the ordinary thing. That is a form of divided attention that is very hard to sustain. And then he went back and developed film and slept somewhere better than the men he had been walking with, which produced its own complicated feeling that a number of them wrote about afterward. Number 15, the truck driver. Convoys moved on roads that had to be cleared each morning, and the drivers went out on them daily, in vehicles that are not fast and cannot leave the road. The work itself is monotonous and physically easier than almost anything below this point on the list. He sat down. He was not carrying anything. He got back, most days, to a base area. What he had instead was the specific psychological texture of doing a routine thing on a route, on a schedule, in a place where routes and schedules are exactly what you do not want to have. Drivers describe an odd double life. Long stretches of ordinary tedious work, in a seat, with the radio on, followed by a shower and a hot meal, in a job where the tedium was the point, and everybody understood what the tedium was concealing. Number 14, the helicopter pilot. Enormous hours, genuinely enormous, flying day after day at a tempo that would not be permitted in any civilian aviation context, in demanding conditions, in aircraft that needed constant maintenance to keep flying. The physical environment inside a cockpit in that climate is punishing. Heat on the ground, cold at altitude several times a day. But at the end of the flying day he went back to a base with structures on it, a bed, a mess hall, a club in many places, ice sometimes. He was doing the most demanding work on this list from the neck up, and one of the least demanding from the neck down, and he slept indoors. That is why he is at 14 and not at 24, and I am aware that a number of people who did it would argue with the placement. Number 13.5, the man on the water point. Somebody ran the purification equipment that turned a river into something a base could drink, and somebody else drove the trailer that took it out to the units. The work was technical, repetitive, and done at a fixed site with a pump and a set of chemicals and a testing routine. It required care rather than strength. It ran every day because people drink every day, and the consequences of doing it badly were spectacular and immediate, which is a particular kind of pressure in an otherwise quiet job. A water point that fails does not fail for one person. It fails for everybody who filled a canteen there. Nobody ever thought about him. Everybody depended on him. That combination describes a surprising number of the jobs in the top half of this ranking, and it is the reason I keep pulling them out of the honorable mentions and giving them numbers. Number 13, the unit armorer. He worked out of a tent or a bunker or a shipping container with tools and a supply of spare parts, and every weapon in the unit came through his hands eventually. The work is skilled, indoors in the loosest sense, seated and endlessly repetitive. Extractor springs, gas rings, firing pins, magazines, the same faults over and over on hundreds of weapons. He lived where the unit lived, which meant a base camp or a firebase with the ordinary comforts of a fixed position. And he had something that almost nobody below him on this list had, which is a fixed daily rhythm. He knew most mornings roughly what his day would consist of. That single fact is worth more than people realize. Let us pause the countdown for a moment, because we are about to cross from the bottom half of this list into the top half. And before we do, you need to know something that changes how you hear the rest of it. How did a man end up with one of these jobs rather than another? Because that is the question underneath the whole list, and the answer is far more arbitrary than anybody comfortable would like. It began with a test. Every man entering the American military of that era took a battery of aptitude tests, and the scores from those tests fed into a classification system. High scores in certain areas opened certain specialities. Low scores closed them. Then came the needs of the service, which is the phrase that did most of the actual work. The military required a certain number of people in each specialty at any given time, and those requirements moved constantly. A specialty that was full in March was short in June. Then came volunteering, which cut both ways. A man who enlisted rather than waiting to be drafted could, in many cases, negotiate a specialty as part of the deal, which is precisely why a great many young men enlisted. A man who was drafted got what he was given. And then came chance, pure, unmanaged administrative chance. Which clerk processed his file? Which unit had a vacancy the week he arrived? Whether a truck was going to one place or another on the morning, he stood outside a replacement center with a bag. Men who served described that last stage with a very particular tone. They stood in a group, a list was read out, and the difference between the top of this ranking and the bottom of it was somebody reading a name from a sheet of paper. There is a specific story shape that appears again and again in these accounts. Two men, same aptitude, same training, same aircraft into the country, standing next to each other. One is sent to a rifle company. The other is sent to a headquarters because somebody noticed he could type. The one who could type spent his year in a chair. And typing in 1967 was a skill that a certain kind of upbringing produced and another kind did not. Which means that a considerable amount of the difference between number 30 on this list and number 1 was decided years earlier in a high school, in a class that some of these boys took and others did not. I'm not going to editorialize about that. I'm simply going to note that it is true and let it sit there and go back to the countdown. Before number 12, a short detour about a thing that shaped every job in the top half of this list and that nobody ever mentions. Electricity. Almost everything that separates the comfortable jobs from the uncomfortable ones on this list runs on it. The fan, the refrigeration, the lights in the office, the radio room, the ice, the film projector, the cold drink, and all of it, on every base and every firebase in that country, came out of generators running on fuel that had been shipped across an ocean, unloaded at a port, trucked or flown to the position, and poured in by hand. Which means the comfort at the top of this ranking was not a natural feature of being in the rear. It was manufactured continuously by a chain of people, and it stopped the moment any link in that chain stopped. Men who lived in base areas described the generator failing as an event with a specific emotional signature. The sound goes, the lights go, the fans stop, and within about 90 seconds, the temperature in a building becomes the temperature outside, and everybody is standing in the dark in the heat, waiting for somebody in a shed to fix it, which he does, because that is his job at any hour, and nobody thanks him because nobody has ever met him. So when I put the clerk typist at number 4, understand what is holding him there. A fan, and behind the fan, a generator, and behind the generator, a fuel handler, a truck driver, a stevedore, a ship, and an ocean. Every comfortable job on this list is sitting on top of a stack of uncomfortable ones. That is not a metaphor. That is literally how the power got to the room. Number 12, the cook. He got up before everybody. That is the defining fact of the job, and it never changed. In a base area, he worked in a mess hall, which is a structure with a roof, which puts him immediately above everybody we have discussed so far. In a smaller position, he worked out of a field kitchen with ranges that ran on gasoline, under canvas, in heat that would close a restaurant kitchen anywhere else on Earth. The work was physical in the ordinary sense, lifting, standing, carrying in temperatures that made an oven redundant, and he was permanently, universally criticized. Every soldier in every army in history has complained about the food, and the man in front of them with the ladle is the only representative of the food supply chain they will ever meet, so he absorbs all of it. What he got in exchange was significant, a fixed place, a fixed schedule even if it started at 4 in the morning, a roof, access to the food, which is not a small thing, and which every cook in every war has quietly used as currency, and in the field kitchens, a reputation. A good cook in a firebase was known by name across the whole position, and men remembered him for 50 years. Number 11, the supply man. Somebody had to receive, sort, store, and issue everything a unit consumed, and that man worked out of a warehouse, a tent, or a shipping container with a clipboard. The job is unglamorous and endless. Things arrive, they are wrong, they are the wrong quantity, they are the wrong size, half of it was needed last week, and the other half nobody ordered. He spends his year reconciling what exists with what the paperwork says exists, which are two different things, in every army that has ever fielded a supply system. He also had power, of a specific and informal kind, that put him near the center of a great deal of trading. The man who controls the boots controls a surprising amount of what happens around him. He lived in a base area, slept indoors or nearly, ate at a mess hall, and was rarely woken at 2 in the morning. By the standards of the men in the bottom third of this list, that is a completely different war. Number 10, the construction engineer. Base areas, runways, roads, bunkers, revetments, and buildings did not arrive by themselves. They were built by engineer units and by naval construction battalions working with heavy equipment, in the heat, in the dust, or the mud depending on the month. The work is hard physical labor with machinery, which is genuinely tiring and which produces the specific fatigue of an ordinary construction job. What sets it apart from everything below is the shape of the day. It has a beginning and an end. He worked, he stopped, he cleaned up, he ate, he slept in the same place he slept last night. They also built their own accommodation, which is one of the small great advantages of being the people who build things. Engineer and construction unit areas in that war were, by universal agreement, better appointed than everybody else's, because the men who lived in them had bulldozers and lumber and knew what to do with both. That produced a certain amount of resentment from everybody else, and every engineer who hears that will smile because they have heard it before. Number 9.5, the shower point and laundry man. I have mentioned more than once tonight that the most desired luxury in that entire country was being clean, and somebody was responsible for producing it. At the larger positions, that meant a proper facility. At smaller ones, it meant a tank on a frame, filled by hand or by trailer, warmed by nothing but the sun, with a chain to pull, and somebody whose job included keeping it filled. The work is unremarkable: plumbing, pumping, hauling, and the endless management of a resource that never quite met demand. What is remarkable is the reception. A man coming in from 3 weeks in the field, standing under water for the first time since he left, is having one of the best experiences of his year, and the person who made that possible is standing 20 feet away, thinking about the pump. There are worse ways to spend a war than being the person who runs the showers. Number 9, the aircraft mechanic. The war ran on aircraft, and aircraft in that climate required an extraordinary amount of maintenance to keep flying. So the mechanics worked in the open, on pads and in revetments, in the heat during the day and under lights at night, on a schedule dictated entirely by when the aircraft were not flying. The hours were long and the conditions were physically unpleasant, with hydraulic fluid and fuel and hot metal and dust in everything. But he was on a base. He had a bunk, a mess hall, a shower, and a place to put his things. He was not carrying anything anywhere. His fatigue was the fatigue of a hard job, not the fatigue of a hard life. And the men who did it describe a kind of ownership that people outside aviation find surprising. A crew chief and his aircraft were not casually associated. He knew that machine. He worried about it. When it came back with something wrong, he took it personally. And when it did not come back, he took that personally, too. Number 8, the military policeman. Traffic control, gate security, convoy escort, and the ordinary business of policing a very large population of young men who were bored, armed, and a long way from home. The last part is the job. Most of what a military policeman in that war actually did was manage the consequences of tedium and alcohol among people his own age, which is a difficult social task and a physically undemanding one. He worked shifts. He lived on a base. He ate hot food. He had a bed, and on most nights he slept in it. And on the nights he did not, it was because his shift was at night, rather than because anything had gone wrong. He was also, universally and permanently, disliked by everybody he encountered, which is the standing occupational hazard of that job in every military that has ever existed. Number 7, the postal clerk. Mail moved through that war in enormous quantity, and moving it was a full-time occupation for a great many people. The work is sorting. Bags in, bags out, sorted by unit, loaded onto aircraft, unloaded, sorted again. It is repetitive, and it is indoors or under cover, and it involves standing up and lifting things that are not heavy. He worked at a base. He had a bunk, a mess hall, a routine, and a beginning and an end to his day. And he had something almost nobody else on this list had, which is the certain knowledge that his work made people happy. A mail clerk in that war was the origin point of the single best moment in most soldiers' weeks. He was carrying letters from mothers, and photographs of children, and packages of foot powder, and hot sauce, and he knew it. And the men who did the job describe it as one of the few assignments where the value was visible every single day. If you are ranking by daily life, that is worth points. Number 6.5, the graves of the paperwork, which is to say the personnel clerk who handled the records of men who did not come back. I said earlier that I was leaving one job outside the ranking entirely, and I am keeping to that. But there is an adjacent one that sat in an office, and that I should name, because the men who did it rarely get named at all. Somebody processed the paperwork, the records, the notifications, the personal effects, the correspondence with families. He was in a building, at a desk, with a fan. On every physical criterion in this ranking, he belongs in the top 10. and a considerable number of the men who did that work describe it as the part of their lives they think about most decades later, because they spent a year reading names. I am placing him here in the comfortable half, with that noted, and moving on without further comment. Some jobs do not fit a comfort scale, and this is one of them. Number 6. The finance clerk. Soldiers had to be paid, and paying several 100,000 people in a war zone is an accounting operation of considerable size. So there were men whose entire year consisted of pay records, allotments, deductions, currency conversion, and the specific complication of a system that used its own money rather than dollars. The work is a desk job? That is not a criticism, it is a description. He sat down in a building with a fan and did arithmetic. And he was, for obvious reasons, extremely popular in a way that had nothing to do with his personality. The man who fixes a problem with your pay is a man everybody is nice to. Number 5. The headquarters communications operator. Radio and teletype traffic at a headquarters ran continuously, and the people running it worked shifts in a room indoors, sitting down, in a building that in many cases had cooling. The job required real skill and a great deal of concentration, and the shift pattern was unfriendly to sleep in the ordinary way that shift work always is. But the physical environment was that of an office. He was clean, he was dry, he was fed. His boots came off at the end of the shift and stayed off. There is a phrase from that period that captures the divide we are approaching, and it is worth introducing here, because we are about to spend the rest of this list inside it. The men in the field had a name for the men in the rear. It is an acronym, it is not polite, and every veteran of that war knows it instantly. It stands, in the cleaned-up version, for a rear echelon fellow of dubious character. The actual word in the middle is not one I am going to say at this hour. That word carried an enormous amount of feeling, and the feeling was not really about the individuals it was aimed at. Most of the men in the rear had been assigned there by the same arbitrary process that sent everybody else where they went. Some of them had done time in the field earlier in their tours. A number of them would have swapped in an instant. The resentment was about the gap itself, about the fact that two men could arrive on the same aircraft, serve the same 12 months, in the same country, in the same uniform, and one of them would spend it wet on the ground, and the other would spend it in an office with a fan. That gap is the largest single fact about daily life in that war, and it is almost never depicted. Number 4. The clerk typist. Here he is, the archetype. He worked in an office. He typed reports, orders, personnel records, morning reports, correspondence, and the endless documentary output of a very large organization doing a very large thing. His day had hours. He knew when it started and roughly when it ended. He ate 3 hot meals in a mess hall. He slept in a bunk in a building with a floor. He had a shower. He had clean clothing, laundered most days. He was bored, frequently and deeply, and boredom is a real cost that I am not dismissing. 12 months of typing other people's paperwork 8,000 miles from home with nothing to do in the evening is not a holiday, and the men who did it did not experience it as one. But on every criterion I set out at the beginning of this program, he is near the top: dry, fed, rested, predictable. Boots off. Number 3. The airmen at a base in Thailand. A significant part of the American air effort operated from bases outside Vietnam, and life on those bases was different in kind, not just in degree. Permanent buildings, air conditioning in many of them, proper mess halls with genuinely good food, because the Air Force of that era had a well-earned reputation for looking after its people better than the other services did, which the other services never stopped mentioning. Clubs, swimming pools in some places, a town nearby, shops. The work was real work, with the long hours that aircraft maintenance and operations demand, and I do not want to make it sound like a posting to a resort. But a man who spent his year on one of those bases lived in a way that a rifleman in the Highlands would not have recognized as the same war. Number 2, the Special Services man. Somebody had to run the clubs, manage the recreation facilities, handle the film projectors, organize the sports, run the libraries, and set up the entertainment. That was a job. Men did it for a year. His working day consisted of ordering supplies for a club, keeping a projector running, arranging a volleyball tournament, and making sure the beer arrived. He lived on a base, in a building, and the whole purpose of his existence was to make other people's evenings better. I want to be careful here, because there is a temptation to be sniffy about it, and that would be wrong. Morale in a long war is not a luxury, and the people who maintained it were doing something the Army considered important enough to staff properly. But if we are ranking daily life, and we are, then a man whose job was to run a club is living a life that the man on the point of a file cannot even picture. Number 1.5, which is to say, the runner-up nobody expects. The man on a supply ship, a carrier, is famous. The ships that carried the cargo were not, and there were a great many more of them. Life on a supply ship or a tanker was, by the standards of this list, extremely good. Air-conditioned in the newer vessels, or at least ventilated in the older ones. A bunk, a galley, laundry, a shower, films, and a working routine of watches at sea, which is demanding in its own way, and which is nothing at all like carrying 60 pounds up a hill. The difference from the carrier is scale rather than kind. Smaller crew, less spectacular facilities, no bakery running through the night, and considerably less noise, which some would count as an improvement. A man could serve his entire tour on one of those ships, in the war, drawing the combat zone pay, and never once set foot in the country. Number 1, the sailor on a carrier offshore. And here we are at the top, and the top is a long way from the bottom. A significant number of Americans served their entire Vietnam tour on ships, and a large aircraft carrier operating off the coast is one of the most comfortable places a young man could possibly have found himself in that decade. Air conditioning. Not a fan, not a breeze through a screen. Refrigerated air throughout the ship, all the time, in a climate that was destroying everybody else. A bunk with clean sheets, changed regularly, in a berthing space with lockers. Hot food 3 times a day, cooked in a proper galley of a standard that men from every other branch described with open envy. Fresh bread from a bakery on board. Ice cream made on the ship. Showers with actual water pressure. Laundry that came back clean and folded. Films in the evening. A ship store. Mail that arrived because the ship was a fixed known address. And the specific fact that mattered most. He was never wet, never muddy, never carrying anything on his back, and never once slept on the ground. The work was hard, and the hours on a carrier during flight operations are punishing, and the flight deck itself is one of the more demanding industrial environments in existence. I am not describing a cruise, but at the end of it he went below into cool air and ate ice cream. That is number 1, and nothing else is close. Before the honorable mentions, a word about what these jobs were actually called, because the vocabulary is half the pleasure of this subject. The American military of that era did not have jobs. It had military occupational specialities, and each one had a code, 2 digits and a letter, and everybody knew their own, and a great many of everybody else's. 11 Bravo was the rifleman. That code is probably the single most recognized piece of military shorthand in American life, and men who held it say it the way other people say the name of a school. Then there were the nicknames, which were universal, and which the official system never acknowledged. The radio operator was the RTO, and he was frequently just called the radio, as in, send the radio forward, which is a slightly unsettling way to refer to a person and which nobody thought twice about. The medic and the corpsman were both doc, always, regardless of service. The senior sergeant was top, or the old man was the company commander, who was frequently 26. The men in the rear had their acronym, which we have already discussed, and which I am still not going to say. A new arrival was in country, for a period during which he was addressed by a set of names that were not friendly and were not meant to be, until he had been there long enough to be given his own. And a man near the end was short, which we covered, and which was announced constantly. That vocabulary did 2 things. It compressed enormous amounts of information into 1 syllable, which is what all professional jargon does, and it sorted everybody instantly. Within 30 seconds of 2 strangers meeting, each of them knew the other's speciality, roughly how long he had been there, and therefore where he sat on the list we have been building tonight. They did not need to ask. That is what a shared vocabulary is for. Now, that was the main list, and if you are already drifting, you can stop here quite happily. But there are a dozen more jobs that belong in this program, and I want to give them their time, because they are the ones that never appear on any list anybody makes, and because several of them are genuinely fascinating. We will place them as we go. The forward observer. He walked with the infantry, carrying an infantryman's load, and his job was to see where artillery fire was landing and correct it. He needed a map, a radio, a view, and the ability to do angular arithmetic in his head under pressure. That combination put him in the field with the rifleman's life and an officer's responsibility, frequently at 22 years old. He belongs somewhere just above the radio operator for the same reasons: extra weight, extra function, same mud. The sniper, small teams, long waits, extreme stillness, and an entirely different relationship with time from the rest of the infantry. The physical demand is lower than a rifleman's in terms of distance covered and load carried, and enormously higher in terms of patience. He lay still for hours. He belongs around the long-range patrol team for the same reason. The demand is on the nerves rather than on the back. The crew chief. Every helicopter had one, and he was responsible for that aircraft. He flew on it, maintained it, and worried about it. His day started before the flying and ended after it, which is a longer day than the pilots had, and he did the physical work in the heat on the pad, but he slept on a base, somewhere around the door gunner, a place or 2 above, the loadmaster. On transport aircraft, somebody has to decide how a load is arranged, secured, and released, because an aircraft with the weight in the wrong place is a serious problem. He worked in a cargo bay, in heat, moving heavy things, flying constantly, and sleeping at a base, around the mechanic, the water purification specialist. Somebody ran the equipment we discussed on another night, taking water out of a river and making it safe for thousands of people. The work was technical, repetitive, done at a fixed site, and completely invisible. Nobody thanked him. Everybody drank, comfortable by the standards of this list, and one of the most consequential jobs on it, which is a combination that says a great deal about how armies work. The fuel handler. Aviation fuel, diesel and gasoline in enormous quantity, in pipelines, in tanker trucks, in bladders, and in drums, moved and stored and dispensed in a hot climate. The work was heavy, dirty, and dangerous in the ordinary industrial sense, and it was done at fixed sites with the ordinary comforts. Around the engineer, the generator mechanic, every base ran on generators, and generators break. He kept the lights on, the radios powered, the refrigeration cold, and the fans turning 24 hours a day, on call in a shed. Unglamorous, indoors, and the reason everybody above number 10 on this list enjoyed anything at all. The stevedore at the port. Ships arrived and had to be unloaded, and the volume of cargo moving through those ports was staggering. The work is heavy manual labor and machinery operation in coastal heat on a shift pattern followed by a bed. Physically among the hardest jobs above number 15 and one of the safest, the air traffic controller, sitting in a tower or a radar room, managing an extremely busy sky for hours with total concentration, indoors, seated, cooled in many cases, and mentally exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with anything else on this list. High on the comfort ranking, and not at all an easy year, the interpreter and the interrogator. Language work, done at headquarters and in the field depending on the role, requiring a skill that took a long time to acquire, and that the military never had enough of. Their conditions varied enormously with the assignment, which is why they are hard to place, but the ones attached to a headquarters lived well. The chaplain's assistant. He carried the chaplain's equipment, arranged services, drove, and handled the logistics of a job whose actual content was pastoral. He went where the chaplain went, which in that war was frequently forward, and he was not armed in the ordinary way. An unusual position, difficult to rank, and one of the very few jobs on this list where the man's day consisted largely of attending to other people's inner lives. The graves registration specialist. I'm including him by name, and then I'm not going to describe the work, because it is the one job in that entire army that I am not going to detail at this hour, and because you can infer it. What I will say is this: the men who did it were quietly regarded by everybody who understood what it involved as doing the hardest thing anybody was asked to do. Not the most dangerous, the hardest. On the criterion I set out at the beginning of this program, which measure daily life rather than danger, I cannot place him at all, so I am placing him outside the ranking with respect. The barber. Yes, there were barbers. Somebody cut several 100,000 heads of hair. He worked in a chair, under cover, all day, doing the same thing, and he heard absolutely everything that happened on that base, because a barber always does. The ice plant operator. On the larger installations there was machinery that made ice, and somebody ran it. In a country where cold was the single most desired commodity, that man was, socially speaking, one of the most important people within a mile of him. He worked indoors, next to refrigeration, in the heat of Southeast Asia. If we are being strictly honest about daily comfort, he might have a case for the top 5. The photographer's assistant in a lab. Film had to be developed, and dark rooms are dark, cool, quiet rooms where somebody stands and works with chemicals. Indoors, seated or standing, cool and quiet. A perfectly ordinary technical job, being done 8,000 miles from home in the middle of a war, in a room where the most alarming thing that could happen was fogging a roll. Now let me put you inside the gap, because the numbers do not land until you see the same day from both ends. It is a Tuesday in the summer of 1968. At 4 in the morning, in the Highlands, a 19-year-old is being touched on the boot to take his watch. His uniform is wet. It has been wet for 11 days. He sits up in the dark and takes the radio handset and stares at a piece of blackness for 2 hours without moving, because moving makes noise. At 4 in the morning, on a ship off the coast, a 19-year-old is asleep in a bunk in a room where the air is 68 degrees under a blanket, because with the air conditioning you need one. At noon, the first man is walking uphill through vegetation with 60 pounds on his back, and he has drunk 4 quarts of water and had nothing to eat since a can of ham and eggs at first light, and his feet have been wet so long that the skin has gone white and soft. At noon, the second man is eating lunch. There are 2 choices. There is bread that was baked on board that morning. At 6 in the evening, the first man is digging in, and then he will clean his rifle in the last of the light, and then he will eat something out of a can, and then it will be dark, and nobody will speak for 11 hours. At 6 in the evening, the second man is watching a film on the mess deck. Same war, same age, same year of their lives, and here is the part that I find hardest to sit with, and I want to say it gently. Neither of them chose. The first man did not volunteer for the Highlands, and the second did not arrange the carrier. A test score, a needs of the service requirement, and a clerk with a list put them where they went. They both did the 12 months. They both came home. And for the rest of their lives, when either of them said the word Vietnam, they were describing 2 different planets. Before we go back down, there is one more thing about the gap that I want to give you, because it is the part the men themselves talk about most, and it is not what you would expect. It was not the comfort that produced the resentment, not really. A rifleman coming out of the field for a few days did not walk into a base area and resent the air conditioning. He used it. He enjoyed it enormously. He ate 4 meals, took 2 showers, slept 12 hours, and thought it was the finest place on earth. What produced the resentment was smaller and stranger, and it was about behavior. It was the haircut regulations enforced on men who had just come out of 6 weeks in the bush. It was being told to shine boots that had been in a paddy the previous morning. It was an inspection. It was somebody who had never left the base area explaining a rule to somebody who had spent the month sleeping on the ground. Every veteran account of that friction lands on the same thing, not the comfort, the ceremony, the application of garrison standards by people living a garrison life to people who had just come in from something else entirely, and you can see both sides of it perfectly clearly. From inside the base area, standards are what keeps a very large organization from dissolving, and the moment you exempt one group, you have no standards at all. That is not a stupid position. It is the position every sergeant major in history has held, and they were mostly right. From the field, it is a man being told about his haircut by somebody who slept in a bed. Nobody was wrong exactly, and the friction was permanent, and it was one of the defining social facts of that army. There is a detail that captures it better than any explanation. Men coming in from the field frequently did not want to go to the big clubs and the big mess halls, even when they were entitled to. They found a corner of the base with their own unit and stayed in it, not because they were unwelcome, because they were filthy and thin and had not spoken to a stranger in weeks, and everything was too bright and too loud and too clean, and the distance was easier to manage from a distance. Their own people said the same thing about coming home a year later, and for the same reasons. Let us go back down to the bottom of the list and spend some proper time there, because I gave those jobs a paragraph each on the way past, and several of them deserve a great deal more than that. Back to the tunnels first. I told you, a man went down a hole with a flashlight and a pistol. Here is what that actually involved, described slowly. The entrance was usually small and concealed, frequently under something ordinary. Once it was found, the first thing that happened was not a man going in. It was waiting and looking and working out whether the entrance itself had been prepared for visitors. Then the man went down feet first through the vertical shaft, which was narrow enough that his shoulders touched both sides, and into a horizontal passage. Now consider the physical geometry. The passage is built for a person of a particular size, and he is bigger than that person. He cannot crawl on hands and knees in most of it. He moves on his elbows and his toes, pushing forward, with his head lower than his hips. He has a flashlight, which he mostly does not use, because a light in a dark passage announces exactly where he is and blinds him to everything beyond its beam. Men who did this work describe moving in the dark by touch for long stretches and using the light in short bursts. The air gets worse the further in he goes. Not dramatically, gradually. It becomes heavier and warmer, and after some minutes his head aches and his breathing changes, and he is aware that he is not getting what he needs from it. There are junctions. Passages branch and change level and double back. Some of them are dead ends, and some of the dead ends are not accidents. And there is the sound situation, which several of them described as the strangest part. Underground in clay, sound behaves oddly. He can hear his own heart and his own breathing at an amplified volume, and almost nothing from outside, and the men above ground can hear almost nothing of him. He is functionally alone in a way that a person on the surface never is. How long did a man do this? Not a year of continuous descents, because there were not that many tunnels. But he was the one who went, whenever there was one, for as long as he was there. Everything in the ranking system I set out at the beginning is at its extreme here, and the men who did it, when interviewed decades later, are notably matter-of-fact about it, which is a pattern you find in every occupation that involves genuine physical fear. The people who do it do not dramatize it. They describe the procedure. Now back to the point, man, at 29. The thing that does not come across in a short description is how much of that job is a skill rather than a nerve. He was reading the ground continuously, not looking for something obvious, reading the way vegetation has been disturbed or has not, whether a path is being used and by how many, the difference between growth that fell and growth that was cut, whether the ground ahead is the shape the map says it should be. That is a form of concentrated observation that human beings can sustain for a surprisingly short time. Most units rotated the point man every 20 or 30 minutes when they could, and the reason was not fairness. It was that the quality of the observation degrades sharply after that, and everybody knew it. So, the job came in short, intense shifts, and between them he walked in the file like everybody else, and recovered. The men who were good at it developed something they generally could not explain. Ask a former point man how he knew, and you will usually get a version of the same answer. It did not look right, not a specific object, a wrongness in the pattern. That is what expertise looks like from the inside in any field. The expert cannot tell you the rule because there is no rule. There is a very large number of hours of pattern exposure sitting under the level where words work. And now, the radio operator, at 27, because his job has a dimension, I skipped. He carried the weight, and we covered that. What I did not say is what the job did to his relationship with everybody else. The radio operator stays with the officer. That is where the radio has to be, so that is where he is all day, every day. He hears every conversation the officer has. He hears the reports from the other units. He hears what is being asked of them before the men around him hear it. He is 19, and he knows more about what is going on than anybody else in the squad, and he cannot always share it. He also becomes, whether he wants to or not, the person who talks to the outside world. When the unit needs artillery or aircraft, or an aircraft to take somebody out, the voice on the radio is his. He learns the procedure words. He learns to speak slowly and flatly under stress, which is a trained skill and not a natural one. Men who did that job describe a specific tiredness that comes from being the channel. Everything went through him, and the machine gunner, at 26, 23 pounds of gun, then the belts, and the spare barrel, and the asbestos glove for changing it, and the cleaning kit, which is bigger than a rifleman's, and the tripod, if the unit carried one. His load was routinely half again what a rifleman carried, and there is no way around it, because a gun that weighs less is a different gun. Everybody helped. That is the part that does not appear in the equipment lists. A squad distributed the machine gun's ammunition across several men, and the arrangement was renegotiated constantly and informally as people got tired. If you want to know how a squad actually functioned as a social unit, watch how it handled the machine gun ammunition, because that is where the real hierarchy and the real generosity both showed up. The gunner himself was usually a large man, or at least a strong one, and he was usually somebody who had chosen it, because a reluctant machine gunner is a problem. And when everything stopped, his was the position that got dug in first and dug in best, and he slept behind it. Now, the medic, at 22, because I want to add the thing I left out. His load included the medical bag, and the medical bag was heavy, and it got heavier as the tour went on, because every medic added to it. Extra bandages, more antibiotic, things he had discovered he needed, and things he had been asked for. But the addition I want to make is about the day rather than the weight. The medic's day had no shape. Everybody else's day had a shape, even the worst ones. Walk here, dig in, take this watch. His day was interruptions, all of them somebody else's problem, all of them arriving without warning, all day, and then his own watch at night like everybody else. Foot inspection at the halt. Somebody's hand, somebody's stomach, the new man with the headache who has not been drinking, the old hand hiding a fever, and the whole time carrying the knowledge that the serious version of his job could arrive at any second, and that everybody was watching to see whether he was good at it. They were 19 and 20 and 21, almost all of them. And the thing that comes through in every account is that they were not primarily thinking about the dramatic part. They were thinking about feet and about whether the antibiotic would last until resupply. And while we are down here, 3 more from the lower half deserve a second look, because I passed them quickly, and each of them has something in it worth having. The mortar crew, at 25. The base plate is the detail that tells you everything. It is a flat slab of steel, whose entire purpose is to be too heavy to move when the weapon fires, which means its usefulness is exactly proportional to how unpleasant it is to carry. There is no clever solution to that. Nobody has ever invented a light base plate, because a light base plate does not work. So it gets carried by a man up a hill and set down and dug in, and then in the morning it gets picked up again. What the crew got in exchange was a specific kind of standing in the unit. A mortar is the infantry's own artillery. It belongs to them, it is theirs, it responds in seconds because it is right there. And the men who ran it were the ones everybody wanted awake at 3 in the morning, the riverine crew at 20. I want to add the sound to what I said before, because the men who did it always mention it. A boat is a metal box with an engine in it, and the crew lives inside the noise, not intermittently, continuously for the whole working day, at close range, with weapons fired over a metal deck when they are fired at all. That produced hearing consequences at a rate that stands out even against the artillery crews. And the water itself was a second job. Everything on a boat has to be maintained against corrosion constantly, and a crew spent an enormous proportion of its time cleaning, greasing, checking, and fighting a slow battle against salt and damp that could be delayed and never won. But the boat came back to the same mooring, and that fact, again, is the axis this whole list turns on. The armored crew at 19. The thing I undersold is the dust. In the dry season, a vehicle moving on a road generates a cloud of fine particulate that coats everything, gets into every moving part, and is breathed by the crew for hours. A column of vehicles means every crew but the first is inside the cloud produced by the ones in front. Men described eating it, coughing it up in the evening, finding it in their ears and in the corners of their eyes for days, and inside the vehicle the temperature. I said it was an oven, and I want to be more precise. The crews took salt and drank water at rates that would alarm a modern occupational safety inspector, doing nothing more strenuous than sitting. What they had was the ride, the storage, and the engine to cook on. On this list, that is worth 11 places. Let us climb back up a little and talk about something that changes the whole ranking, which is time. Every American in that war had a date, not a vague sense of an ending, an actual date known from the beginning on which his tour would be over. That single administrative fact shaped the entire psychological experience of the war, and it shaped it differently at different ends of this list. For a man in the top 10, the date was the structure of a boring year. He counted, and the counting gave shape to something that was otherwise undifferentiated. One office day is much like another, and the calendar was how he knew he was progressing. For a man in the bottom 10, the date was something else entirely. It was the thing he was walking toward through 180 separate ordinary days, each of which had to be survived individually. And in both cases, the last few weeks did something to people. The vocabulary for it was universal. A man with a small number of days remaining was short, and the joking about it was elaborate and constant and formulaic, and everybody participated. Underneath the joke there was real behavior change. Men in the last stretch became careful. Sergeants pulled short-timers off certain duties quietly, and the men themselves became meticulous about the small things that they had been careless about for 11 months. The tablets, the socks, the water. There is something both funny and sad in that. A man who spent most of a year being 20 and careless, becoming, in the last 3 weeks, the most disciplined person in the platoon, because the exit was visible. Now, an argument about the ranking, because rankings exist to be argued with, and I want to give you the strongest case against mine. I ranked by daily life, comfort, sleep, weight, wetness, predictability. By that measure, the carrier sailor is at the top, and the tunnel rat is at the bottom, and it is not close. But there is a completely different ranking you could build, and a great many veterans would build it, and it would come out almost exactly upside down. Rank instead by how the year sat with the man afterward. By that measure, some of the jobs at the bottom of my list come out very high. A man who was a medic, or a point man, or a machine gunner, was doing something whose value he could see for people he knew by name, at an age when almost nobody gets to be genuinely necessary. A great many of them describe that year, for all its misery, as the period in which they mattered most. And some of the jobs at the top of my list come out very low by that measure. A man who typed morning reports for 12 months in an office, 8,000 miles from home, and then went back to an ordinary life, frequently describes a strange hollowness about it. He was there. He was not there. He has a service record and no story, and when other men talk, he stays quiet. That divide is real, and it lasted decades, and it produced a particular kind of quiet awkwardness at reunions that anybody who has attended one will recognize. So, the honest position is this. If you are asking which job you would have wanted to be assigned, my ranking is right, and the carrier is the answer. If you are asking which job the men themselves came to value having done, the list bends into an entirely different shape, and the bottom becomes the top. Both of those things are true at once, and neither of them cancels the other, and the men who were there hold both without difficulty. Let us look at the middle of the list for a while, because the extremes get all the attention, and the middle is where most people actually lived. The middle of this ranking is populated by men in fixed positions, fire bases, base camps, airfields, depots, not walking, not on a ship, somewhere in between. And life in a fixed position had a texture of its own that neither end of the list shared. Start with the physical place. A fire base is a cleared circle on a piece of high ground, with a perimeter of wire and bunkers, guns in the middle, and a landing area. Everything in it was built by the men in it, out of sandbags, timber, steel planking, and whatever the resupply brought. That means the men living there spent an enormous proportion of their time doing construction. Filling sandbags is the single most universally remembered activity of that war among men who served in fixed positions, and the numbers involved are difficult to believe. A single bunker takes hundreds, a perimeter takes thousands, and sandbags rot in that climate, so the work never finished. A man in a fire base could reasonably describe his year as filled sandbags, improved the bunker, fired the gun, filled more sandbags. But he slept in the same place every night, and that is the dividing line that this entire ranking turns on. He also had a community. A fixed position develops a society within about a week. There is a place where people gather. There is somebody who has a radio and plays music. There is a card game with a fixed membership. There is a dog, in an extraordinary number of cases, adopted from somewhere and belonging to everybody. There are the small businesses of the position, the man who cuts hair, the man who can fix things, the man whose family sends the best packages, and who has therefore become socially important. None of that exists in a unit that sleeps somewhere different every night. That is the real difference between the middle of this list and the bottom. And it is not the comfort. It is that the middle had a place and the bottom had a route. Now let me take you through a fire base at 3 in the morning. slowly, because it is exactly the right hour for it. The guns are quiet. There was a fire mission at 11 and another at 1:30, and the crews got up both times and worked in the dark and went back down. The perimeter bunkers each have a man awake, and none of them are talking to each other, and each of them is looking at the same piece of wire he has been looking at for 3 hours. The generator is running somewhere, which is the sound underneath everything, and which everybody stopped hearing weeks ago and would notice instantly if it stopped. In the fire direction bunker, somebody is awake with a light on and a radio at low volume. Somewhere along the wire, a man on his 3rd hour is eating cold beans out of a can with a plastic spoon, quietly in the dark, because there's nothing else to do, and it is something to do. The air has finally cooled a little, which is the one gift the night gives, and in about 90 minutes everybody will be woken for stand to, because the hour before first light is the hour when things happen, and until the sky changes color, every man in that circle will be awake and in position and looking outward. That is the middle of the list. Not comfortable. Not carrying anything either. A place with a routine and a generator. Before the officers, there is a dimension of this ranking that I have been quietly ignoring, and it deserves a section of its own. The year matters. This list is not stable across the whole war. A job that sat at number 20 in 1965 was a different job by 1970, because the whole apparatus around it changed. Think about what happened to the physical infrastructure over those years. In the early period, the American presence was comparatively small, and the installations were improvised. Men lived in tents. Base areas were being cleared and built while people lived in them. There was mud everywhere, because nothing had been paved yet. Supply was thinner. The food in the rear areas was closer to the food in the field than it later became. By the later years, some of those same locations had become enormous permanent complexes with paved roads, hard buildings, air conditioning in a growing number of places, proper mess halls, clubs, shops, swimming pools, television broadcasting, and a domestic economy of considerable size. So, a supply clerk in 1965 was living in a tent in the mud, with a fan, if he was lucky, and a supply clerk in 1970 at the same location was in a building with a floor. Same job, same ranking position relative to the infantry. Completely different year. And the infantry side of the list moved too, though less dramatically because vegetation and rain and 60 pounds do not modernize. What did change for them was everything around the walking. Better boots, designed for that climate. A uniform that dried. The rifle problems we spent a whole other night on. Fixed. Freeze-dried rations for patrols. Better medical evacuation. Vastly more helicopters, which changed how far a unit had to walk and how quickly things reached it. A rifleman in 1970 was doing the same job as a rifleman in 1965 with substantially better equipment and a considerably better supported system behind him, which means that if you asked two veterans to rank these jobs and they served 5 years apart, they would give you 2 different lists, and both would be right. That is true of every long war. The war a man describes is the war of his particular 12 months, and the men who arrived after him were in a different one, wearing the same name. There is an entire category I have not touched, and I should, because it does not fit anywhere on the list, and it needs its own place. The officers. A platoon leader in the field lived exactly the life of the men he commanded. Same mud, same load, roughly, though usually a little lighter because he needed his hands and his attention rather than his back. Same rain, same ground, same watch rotation. What he had on top of that was the decisions. He was frequently 22 or 23 years old, sometimes with a few months of experience, responsible for 30 or 40 people, most of them within 2 years of his own age, some of them with considerably more time in country than he had. That is an extraordinarily difficult social position, and the ones who handled it well handled it by listening to their sergeants and saying so. Where does that sit on my ranking? Physically, with the riflemen. In terms of what the year cost, considerably lower, because the specific weight of deciding things for other people at 22 does not have an equivalent anywhere else on this list. The company commander, a step up, had the same conditions with more scope and slightly more distance. And then there is the staff officer, who is an entirely different animal. He worked at a headquarters, in a building, on paper, in a job that, in any other context, would be recognizable as management. Long hours, real responsibility, a desk, a bed, and hot food. On the criteria I set out at the beginning, he belongs comfortably in the top 10, and a great many of them had done a field tour earlier and knew exactly what they were no longer doing, which raises a point worth making plainly. A significant number of the men in the comfortable jobs on this list had previously done one of the uncomfortable ones. The Army moved people. A man could spend 6 months in the field and finish his tour in a rear job, and that pattern was common enough that any assumption about somebody based on where you found him was probably wrong. There is another group entirely absent from this ranking, and their absence says more about the ranking than about them. Women served in that war, not in the roles we have been discussing, because the rules of the period did not permit it, but in very substantial numbers in others, in medical roles, in administration, in communications, in intelligence, in supply, and in the recreational programs run for the troops. Their conditions varied as widely as everybody else's did, from air-conditioned offices to hospitals near the fighting, and I am not going to attempt to slot them into a list built around infantry loads, because the list would not measure the right things. What I will say is that the medical personnel among them had a year that does not belong anywhere on a comfort ranking, for the same reason I excluded one job earlier. The work was indoors and dry and fed. It was also, by every account any of them has given, the hardest thing they ever did. Those two facts do not resolve into a number, and there is a third group, larger than either, who are almost never included in any account of this war written in English: the Vietnamese who worked on the American bases. Tens of thousands of local civilians worked inside those installations every day. Laundry, kitchens, cleaning, construction, clerical work, drivers, interpreters, barbers, the whole enormous domestic apparatus that a base of several thousand people requires. They came through the gate in the morning and left in the evening, and they did the work, and they went home to a country that was having a war fought in it. I cannot rank their jobs on a scale designed for men on 12-month tours, and it would be crass to try. But any honest account of who was doing what inside an American base in that war has to include the fact that a large proportion of the people in it were not American and were not soldiers and were going home at the end of the day to a situation none of the Americans were going home to. Now, let me go back to the top of the list, because I gave numbers 3, 2 and 1 a fairly brisk treatment on the way past, and the top deserves the same attention I gave the bottom, Back to the carrier. The thing that made a large ship so different was not any single luxury. It was that a ship is a self-contained industrial town that has solved permanently every environmental problem the men on land were losing to. Water, made on board, in quantity, from the sea, unlimited by the standards of anybody on land. Air, refrigerated and circulated everywhere all the time. Food, cooked in industrial galleys with cold storage, with a bakery running through the night, with ice cream machines. Men from a carrier remember the bakery. Fresh bread at 2 in the morning for the night shift, which is a detail that sounds trivial, and which a rifleman would have found almost incomprehensible. Laundry, industrial, on board, returned folded. Sleep, a bunk in a berthing compartment with a curtain in cool air. Now the costs, because there were some and they were real. A ship is crowded in a way that is difficult to convey. Personal space is measured in the volume of a bunk and a locker. There is no going outside for a walk. The same several thousand people in the same steel spaces for months. Flight operations are extremely noisy, and they run at all hours, and the sound of aircraft landing on a deck transmits through the whole structure. Men in compartments under the flight deck describe sleeping through something that visitors find impossible. And the work itself, particularly on the flight deck, is one of the most demanding and unforgiving industrial environments that exists anywhere, then or now. But at the end of the shift, he went below into cool air and ate ice cream and slept in a bed. On my criteria, that is number 1, and it is not arguable. Back to Thailand at number 3, the bases in that country supported a very large part of the air campaign, and they were built as permanent installations rather than field positions, which changes everything about how a year there felt. Buildings with walls, air conditioning in the working spaces and in a good many of the living spaces, mess halls of a standard that men from the other services described with something close to disbelief, clubs with proper bars, pools in several places, a local town with restaurants and shops and a life, reachable on a day off, because there were days off. The work was demanding, and the hours during heavy operations were long, and I do not want to leave you with the impression that these were postings without pressure. But the difference between a young man's 12 months in that environment and a young man's 12 months in the Highlands is the difference between an unpleasant job abroad and something for which we have a different vocabulary altogether. And back to the clerk at number 4, because he takes more criticism than anybody on this list, and some of it should be answered. The paperwork was not optional. A force of that size, in that place, generated a volume of documentation that is genuinely hard to picture, and every piece of it was somebody's afternoon. Personnel records determined whether a man got paid, got promoted, got his mail, got home on the right date. Morning reports determined whether the Army knew where its people were. Get it wrong, and a man's family stops receiving money. Get it wrong, and somebody is not where the records say he is. The men who did it were doing a real job badly needed, in conditions of monotony that a modern office worker would recognize instantly, and they were held in contempt for it by men who had been assigned differently by the same clerk. And a fair number of them, when the war ended and the years passed, found that they did not talk about it much, which brings me to the last thing I want to say before we go through the list one final time. I have been ranking these jobs by how the year felt while it was happening. There is a completely different question, which is what each job left behind. and the answers there do not line up with my ranking at all. The hearing damage from artillery, aircraft and weapons fired without protection landed on the men in the middle and lower middle of this list as heavily as anywhere. The backs and the knees landed on the bottom third, on schedule, 20 and 30 years later, exactly as you would predict from 60 pounds on a young spine. The skin and the fever mostly cleared up within weeks of a man being dry and clean again, which is one of the few genuinely good pieces of news in this entire subject. And the thing that sat with people afterward, in whatever form it took for each of them, did not respect the ranking at all. It arrived where it arrived. Men from the top of this list carried things home, and men from the bottom of it came home fine. And the reverse, and no ordering anybody could construct would have predicted which is a good reason not to take my list too seriously, and I say that as the person who just spent an hour and a half building it. There is one more comparison that puts this entire list into focus faster than anything else I could say, and it is about money. What did these men get paid? Base pay in the American military of that period was set by rank and by years of service, and by any civilian standard for the work involved, it was modest. A young enlisted man at the bottom of the scale was earning an amount per month that would strike a modern listener as almost unbelievable for what was being asked. Then there were the additions, there was an allowance structure, and there was a monthly payment for service in a combat zone. Here is the part that matters for tonight. That combat zone payment was flat. It was the same amount every month for everybody serving in country, which means the tunnel rat and the clerk typist received exactly the same addition to their pay. The point man at the front of a file and the man running the film projector at the club received exactly the same addition to their pay. Number 30 on this list and number 4 on this list identical. I am not raising that to be provocative. It is simply the clearest possible illustration of a truth about very large organizations, which is that they cannot price individual experience. A system administering hundreds of thousands of people cannot assess the relative misery of each assignment and pay accordingly. So it uses a rule that is coarse and fair in form and wildly unequal in effect. Are you in the country? Yes or no? Every institution does a version of this. Salary bands, job titles, grades. The rule has to be simple enough to administer at scale. And the moment it is simple enough to administer at scale, it stops describing anybody's actual life. The men noticed. Of course they noticed. It is one of the most commonly mentioned grievances in the whole literature, and it is mentioned lightly with a shrug, because there was never any prospect of it being otherwise, and everybody understood that too. While we are on the subject of things distributed equally that were not experienced equally, there is the week away. Every man got one, a period of leave, taken outside the country, in one of several cities where the military had arranged facilities, and where an entire local economy existed to serve young Americans with money, and 1 week. But the value of that week was not the same for everybody, and it varied inversely with your position on this list. For a man from the bottom third, that week was a transformation. He arrived from months of sleeping on the ground, filthy, thin, with skin conditions and a permanent low fatigue. 7 days later, he had slept in a bed every night, eaten real food, been clean continuously, and repaired an astonishing amount of damage. Men describe it as the best week of their lives, and then describe the return as the worst day. For a man from the top of the list, it was a nice holiday. He had been sleeping in a bed anyway. He had been eating well anyway. The week was a change of scene rather than a rescue. Same benefit, same duration, completely different value, distributed exactly opposite to how the misery was distributed. There is a pattern in that which anybody who has worked inside a large organization will recognize instantly, and it is not unique to armies. Now, what happened to all of these jobs afterward? Some of them no longer exist in any recognizable form. The tunnel work belonged to a very specific tactical situation and did not carry forward as a standing speciality. The radio operator carrying a heavy set on his back for an officer has been transformed out of recognition by 6 decades of electronics. The function survives. The 25-pound box does not. The typist pool is gone entirely, replaced by the fact that everybody types now, which quietly closed off one of the main routes by which a young man in 1967 could end up in an office instead of a paddy. Others are essentially unchanged. Somebody still cooks. Somebody still fixes the aircraft, still fills the sandbags, still runs the generator, still sorts the mail, still stands at a gate at 3 in the morning. The equipment is better, and the names have changed, and the job is the job. And the fundamental structure of the list has not changed at all in any army anywhere. There is still a small group carrying everything on their backs at the front, and a large group behind them in buildings making that possible, and a distance between the two that neither can quite explain to the other. That is not a criticism of anybody. It is simply the shape of the thing. It was the shape in every war before this one, and it will be the shape in the next. Let me now go back through the whole ranking, slowly, from the bottom to the top, the way you would count something to fall asleep. 30. The tunnel rat, going down a hole feet first with a flashlight he mostly does not use. 29. The point man at the front of the file reading the ground for 20 minutes at a time, because that is as long as anybody can. 28. The engineer clearing the same road every morning at the pace that thoroughness requires. 27. The radio operator carrying the extra weight and the antenna and everything everybody says. 26. The machine gunner with 23 pounds before the ammunition and a squad quietly rearranging his belts among themselves. 25. The mortar crew with the base plate, dug in first, woken first. 24. The long-range patrol, out for days, not cooking, not talking, communicating by touch. 23. The rifleman, 60 pounds, wet for months, boots off at 4 in the afternoon, drying his feet with a rag. 22. The medic, carrying all of that plus a bag, with a day made entirely of other people's interruptions. 21. The dog handler, watering the animal before himself and reading its ears all day. 20. The riverine crew, never dry, never marching, sleeping on the boat. 19. The armored crew, carrying nothing, sitting inside an oven. 18. The artilleryman on a firebase, up at 2 in the morning, to fire and back down again. 17. The door gunner, in the air all day and in a bed at night. 16. The photographer, working while everybody around him was only surviving. 15. The truck driver, on the same road, at the same hour, with the radio on. 14. The pilot, enormous hours, and a mess hall at the end of them. 13. The armorer, with his extractor springs and his gas rings and his fixed daily rhythm. 12. The cook, up at 4, criticized by everybody, remembered by name for 50 years. 11. The supply man with his clipboard and his quiet power. 10. The construction engineer, hard physical work, and the best-built quarters on the base because he built them. 9. The aircraft mechanic out on the pad under lights, taking his aircraft personally. 8. The military policeman working shifts, disliked by everybody, sleeping in a bed. 7. The postal clerk, sorting the best moment of everybody else's week. 6. The finance clerk, doing arithmetic in a building with a fan. 5. The communications operator at a headquarters, indoors, clean, on shifts. 4. The clerk typist, bored for 12 months, dry for 12 months. 3. The airman in Thailand, with air conditioning and a swimming pool. 2. The special services man, running a club, in charge of everybody else's evening. 1. The sailor on the carrier, refrigerated air, clean sheets, fresh bread, ice cream. Never wet, never muddy, never once slept on the ground. That is the list. And now one last picture at the very end, because it is the one that stays with me. It is a Thursday afternoon in the dry season. A helicopter comes into a firebase with the resupply, and among the things it drops off is a man. He has been in the country for 4 days. He is clean. His uniform is the color uniforms ere when they are new, which is a shade nobody else on that hill has worn for months. His boots are black. He is carrying a bag. He steps down into the red dust, and the aircraft leaves, and the noise goes away, and he stands there. And a dozen men look at him. They are thin and dark, and their uniforms have gone a pale washed-out green, and their boots are the color of the ground. Not one of them says anything for a moment. Then somebody takes his bag, and somebody else says something that is not friendly and is not unkind, and he is absorbed. In 3 weeks, his boots will be the color of the ground too, and he will have stopped noticing the smell, and he will know, without being told, which bunker leaks, and who has the good hot sauce, and how the watch rotation works. And in 11 months, he will be standing on a runway, in a faded uniform, thin and dark, watching a group of clean, pale men come down the steps of an aircraft with their bags, and he will say something to them that is not friendly and is not unkind. Somewhere on this list, whichever number he drew, that is what the year actually was. And here is the thing I want to leave you with, and then I will let you go. Every single one of those men, all 30 of them, was in the same country in the same year, wearing a uniform of the same government, doing a job he had been assigned by a system that mostly did not consult him about it. The distance between the top and the bottom of that list is enormous. It is one of the largest gaps in daily experience that has ever existed inside a single organization at a single moment. And almost none of it was chosen. A test score, a requirement, a clerk with a list. There is no moral in that, and I am not going to invent one. It is simply how very large organizations distribute the people inside them, and it has been true of every army that has ever existed, and it will be true of the next one. What I will say is that the men at the bottom of this list mostly do not want your pity, and the men at the top of it mostly do not want your judgment, and both of those positions are entirely reasonable, and the veterans themselves worked all of this out among themselves a long time ago. The tunnel is empty now. The road has been cleared. The base plate has been carried up the hill and set down and dug in. The extra load has been handed out, and somebody took more than his share without mentioning it. The guns are quiet. The generator is still running somewhere because somebody in a shed is keeping it running, and because of him there is a fan turning in an office where a 19-year-old has finished typing the morning report. The mail has been sorted. The bread is in the oven on a ship a long way offshore, for the men who will come off the night shift at 2, and the air conditioning is holding steady at 68 degrees. And on a hilltop, a man who drew a different number is sitting with his boots off, drying his feet with a rag in the last of the light, about to open a can. And if you are still with me at this hour, do one small thing before you drift off. Tap the like button and subscribe so the next one finds you tomorrow night. And tell me in the comments where you were listening from, and if you served, what your job was, and where you would have put it on this list. I read every one of them, and the corrections are usually better than the program. Sleep well. I will be here again tomorrow night with something else that takes a long time to say.